Welcome, everyone, to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, Culture Editor here at the Federalist. As always, you can email the show at radio@thefederalist.com. Coming to you today with Inez Stepman, Senior Policy Analyst at the Independent Women's Forum, also a senior contributor to the Federalist. Inez, welcome back once again to Federalist Radio Hour.
It's so good to be back here with you. I'm on the competition train. I saw your guys' coverage of election night, which was fantastic, by the way. But there were all these counts on, who's drinking what, who's smoking what. So, I figured if Dave Marcus can do it, I can too.
Yeah, election night got a little boozy. We're good Americans. We're good Americans. So Inez is here today to talk about what the cultural landscape might look like in a Biden presidency. I want to actually start off by asking a question I think a lot of people are considering right now, which is, will the culture war be better for the left or for the right under a Biden presidency? And that may seem like a silly, pointless question, but there's actually a lot to think about. I'm of the opinion that it will probably provide very fertile ground for conservatives and other kind of heterodox thinkers, leftist dissidents, because there will be a lot of opposition to Biden from the left, and that will create a lot of agreement on the right. But I don't know what you think. What do you think about that, Inez?
I absolutely agree with you. I think this is going to be a paradoxically centrist/woke presidency, because they're not going to be able to move large pieces of legislation, most likely. I mean, we still have those outstanding races in Georgia, but even especially with Senator Manchin, sort of pumping the brakes on packing the court or getting rid of the filibuster. I think what's going to be open to them to satisfy their base is going to be a lot of dear colleague letters from the administrative state and a lot of executive orders surrounding cultural issues. And I think that is also really convenient for the Democratic Party, or they think it is now, but I think it'll be devastating long term, I should say, because frankly, their coalition has a lot more disagreements on economic policy. There's a lot more vicious infighting about whether, Medicare for all is a good idea. So I actually think this is going to seem like a short-term way to make everybody in his coalition happy. And I think long-term, it is exactly the opposite of what the American people voted for in 2020. And I think there will be a large backlash and a centralization of a broader GOP coalition that is at its heart, I think, at its heart is going to be sort of anti-woke. It's going to be the culture war against the woke. And one of the things I thought was particularly interesting in the 2020 results were the number of people who split their ticket, who voted for Biden and then voted for Republicans down ticket. Now, you could Lincoln, project this and say, oh, it's Republicans who are disgusted with Trump. I don't think that's at all what happened. I mean, every survey shows that an extraordinarily high percentage of Republicans support the president. And actually, I mean, this is somewhat anecdotal, but I think a higher percentage of Republicans supported him than the last time. And there's a lot of, myself included, there's been a lot of people who were very suspicious of him in 2016 and were very happy actually with the job that he did and his administration did. So I don't think it's Republicans who are splitting their ticket by voting for Biden. I think there were a lot of people who voted probably for Hillary last time around, who maybe consider themselves moderate Democrats, maybe the liberal left, the remnants of the liberal left, who split their tickets, couldn't stomach, like the Andrew Sullivan types, right? Couldn't stomach voting for Donald Trump, but really want to check on the left's influence in this next administration. And I think that's really we're all reading tea leaves here. Like there's no concrete way to be certain about this, but that is my feeling about what this election means. And I think that's why I think that even though this seems like a good short-term option for the Biden administration to make his coalition happy, I think in the long run, it's going to expose the cracks in the left, and it's going to move a lot of people over to the Republican Party.
It's reading tea leaves to an extent, but today we had an example of something more concrete, your point, which was that the founder of Black Lives Matter, Patrisse Cullors, sent a a letter to Joe Biden and to Kamala Harris saying, we invested, it's sort of purporting to speak for all Black Americans, but said, we invested in your election, and, will you, we look forward to taking a meeting with you in the near future. Now, this was a really interesting development, actually, from my perspective, because there were so many people who said, pay no attention to the formal Black Lives Matter group. They have no sway. They're just the .com. They're just the institution. They're not, the movement is so much bigger than that institution itself. And we had people saying that all summer, so people who were, complaining that the left was or that the right was making a big issue out of the Black Lives Matter website's statement on dissolving the nuclear family, or thinking beyond the nuclear family. That's, people were saying, it's okay. You don't have to freak out about all of this. Black Lives Matter is a pop culture phenomenon. It's not the .com website. What do you think the significance is of BLM sort of speaking to Biden and Kamala Harris through this letter in that way, and making their expectations very clear as votes are literally still being counted?
Well, first of all, I think it's kind of true that the group is a stand-in for a much larger movement that has, some differences with the group itself that has been around for a little bit longer. But that being said, let's not forget, defunding the police became a mainstream Democratic position. We had all those polls over the summer saying between 40 and 55% of registered Democrats said, yeah, defund the police, right? Some of their more extreme positions are more mainstream in the Democratic Party. And this was always sort of the argument with Biden, right? And he says himself, he calls himself a transitionary figure. The question is, transitionary to what? I think he imagines himself sort of handing the reins to a more Pete Buttigieg sort of neoliberal party. And that very well might be the case. But I don't think that BLM and some of the harder progressive groups, I don't think the Squad is, first of all, they were never particularly happy with the shotgun marriage with Joe Biden. He doesn't come into those negotiations with a lot of faith on their part. And I think he's going to have a really hard time, again, because he can't move any of the sort of bigger legislation that he might have been hoping to move. And I don't think he was hoping, for example, to move legislation on packing the court. But for example, to move healthcare legislation, he could point to that as a real sort of progressive advancement, even if it wasn't the Medicare for all that the Bernie supporters wanted. Without that, I think he's going to have to show something to his left flank. And to return to the previous question, I think that's going to be a lot of woke executive orders, right? I don't expect the Trump administration executive orders on critical race theory to last very long in a Biden administration. I also expect him to revive a lot of the policies of the Obama administration in education. So there were two, in my view, incredibly destructive policies imposed on every public school in the nation under the Obama administration, just with a letter. Right. This isn't even going through the rulemaking process. And I don't want to get too much into the weeds of administrative law, but this isn't even going through the replacement sort of procedure that is supposed to essentially replace the Constitution and the way that we're supposed to make a law, and the executive branch is supposed to execute the law, and Congress is supposed to write the law. Right. Even beyond that, the Administrative Procedure Act governs rulemaking. And it's quite difficult. You have a long notice and comment period. You do have public input to some extent. It's like a process that can take years to complete. So what the Obama administration popularized is just writing a letter saying, oh, by the way, we're going to enforce the law this way, so you might get sued if you don't fall in line. So it wasn't formally a rule, but it was very effective in getting all kinds of institutions to change their behavior. So specifically with regard to schools, the Obama administration had two big Dear Colleague letters. They had a third one I'll get to in a minute, but there was actually rulemaking on, so it'll be a little more complicated. But so one is on school discipline, right? So restorative justice, basically woke discipline, saying that because there might be disparate rates of suspension or expulsion or referrals to law enforcement between students of different racial backgrounds, that means that there is discrimination going on. right? It's not any other factor. It's not that, for example, just to pull one confounding factor out of my rear end, it might be that, for example, Black students are less likely to have a father in the home, right? But they just look at the top line number. There's a disparity between the number of Black students suspended, the number of white students suspended. So this restorative justice policy is supposed to ameliorate that by essentially dialing down the number of times or discouraging schools from suspending, expelling students, or referring them to law enforcement. We saw the tragic consequences that kind of policy can have in Broward County, where the shooter there, Nicholas Cruz, I mean, he did things that in previous eras under different systems would have absolutely had him referred to law enforcement. And then some of those calls that went to the tip line about him would have been taken a lot more seriously because he would have had an actual criminal background. He wouldn't have been going to school anymore. I mean, he brought bullets to school. He made real threats. He there's a whole list of things that he did that were not just against the rules of the school, but like criminal, like he could have been prosecuted for. So that's one, I think, woke avenue I would expect to see, in the first few weeks, certainly in the first 100 days of a Biden administration, to restore that Dear Colleague letter that threatens schools with investigation, with essentially civil rights investigations, if they have disparities in those numbers, and then encouraging restorative justice as a way to try to balance those numbers out. And then the second piece of it that I expect to see almost immediately is another Obama era policy that didn't get a lot of attention at the time because there was some back and forth on it. There was pushback from schools, and it didn't really get fully implemented before the Obama administration actually left office. But that is a trans accommodation policy, right? So with the stroke of a pen, they reinterpreted Title IX, reinterpreted Title VII of the Civil Rights Act as well, and said that in order to not be discriminating on the basis of sex, very similar reasoning as Bostock, by the way, the Supreme Court decision, in order to not discriminate on the basis of sex, you have to allow students access to the locker rooms and bathrooms that they of their claimed gender identity. So those two things I expect to come back very, very quickly. The third thing that I think will be more complicated for them, and this is all power to Betsy DeVos for going through the actual long rulemaking process I referenced, that is sexual assault on college campuses. She actually promulgated a rule that gives students some modicum of due process, right, which is access to counsel and representation, access to the ability to cross-examine through a third party. So essentially what you saw that lawyer that the Republicans hired for the Kavanaugh hearings do, right? Ask about dates, times, places, memories, right? That kind of cross-examination through a third party. And then got rid of something called the single investigator model, which is just wildly unfair. It's the same one biased person from the Title IX office asks questions, takes notes, and then renders a verdict. There's no you don't even know when you're answering some of these questions what you're being accused of. I mean, it was really bad before the Department of Education actually went back and promulgated a rule that did put some due process back into this. Now, I don't know how much it's going to help. It certainly prevents them from doing the Dear Colleague letter thing, or I would hope it would prevent them from doing that and making it that quick and easy to reverse that policy. They're probably going to have to go through rulemaking. But they can also wink, wink, nod, nod at the schools through Dear Colleague letter or whatever else, or just through other channels. Hey, we're not going to enforce this, right? And the universities are desperate, to continue their kangaroo court style inquisition. With an administration that's sympathetic to that kind of kangaroo court, I don't see it being a real barrier to universities, though.
Yeah, and this is an important point. I mean, Biden is he's kind of a centrist in today's Democratic Party on fiscal issues only, right? So he's not willing to go so far as to say, yes, let's have Medicare for all, let's have, every radical tenet of the Green New Deal implemented, let's do X, Y, and Z. To be sure, he has some anti-business ideas and tendencies, absolutely.
Well, but on economic issues, right? So if you're looking at whether or not the Bernie wing of the Democratic Party was successful in dragging the party economically left from where it was, as opposed to where they would like it to be, I mean, his platform is economically left of Obama's. Except
and
for
of
that one.
Hillary Clinton's in 2016. And that's McClatchy analysis' conclusion. That's not us saying it. McClatchy analyzed Biden's platform and Clinton's platform and said Biden's platform was much further left than Hillary Clinton's was in 2016. So to your point about the radicalization of the party and Bernie's impact on the party, it happened before the primary started because Biden entered with a platform that had been moved left by the Bernie revolution.
That's true, and I realize that the socialist wing of the Democratic Party is definitely not happy with those crumbs, and that they see Biden as a centrist and neoliberal, and in many ways he is, right. His orientation really is that. So it's not that they're completely wrong about that, but as a matter of policy platform, we would be amiss if we didn't point out the fact that the policy platform has moved, as you said, from Hillary's and certainly from Obama's platform. So the direction, even on economics, in the Democratic Party is left.
Yeah, absolutely. And the point that is important to make here is there's a huge schism between where the party is, the establishment of the party is economically, and where they are culturally. So when we use this label like centrist or moderate for Biden, it does not apply at all to his platform cultural issues or his general approach to cultural issues. Because we saw that clip that happened in a debate, it was a town hall, an ABC town hall with George Stephanopoulos, where Biden said, if an 8-year-old says they want to transition their gender, they want to be, another gender, and that's going to make them happy, there should be no discrimination against that. The word discrimination, we know exactly how the left interprets the word discrimination. And we know that it means things like the Equality Act. And we know that it means things like the Dear Colleague letter. And we know that it means all of these, we know how they interpret the word discrimination to be bigotry is anything that disagrees with their full, far leftist viewpoint. So it's not just on that issue either. It's on, the full spectrum of cultural issues. You cannot call some of these neoliberals and these sort of centrist, fiscally centrist Democrats, you cannot call them moderates. You cannot call them centrists. They're radicals. And you just pointed to 3 really good examples of how that will impact the education department. But depending on how the Senate plays out, this is a really serious question. They will bring up the Equality Act right away. Yeah. Is that correct?
So I was thinking about this earlier, and I think you might have brought it up in some other forum about passing the Equality Act. I think the 2 most likely things they're actually have a shot of advancing are the Equality Act and the ERA, which do awfully similar things, actually. So it might be one or the other. But I think because the GOP, as contrasted to the Republican coalition that's forming, right? I really think this election is going to form an anti-woke coalition on the right that's going to disagree about a lot of other stuff, especially they're going to disagree about healthcare. They're going to disagree about, sort of deregulation. They're going to disagree about trade policy because some of the states we're talking about have wildly different interests in terms of the economic sphere and trade with other countries. I think all of those things are going to actually take a second seat within the party, both directions. So like the tax cut and deregulatory agenda that Paul Ryan was famous for, and the sort of new influx of sort of working class voters who are more interested in having a bigger government agenda. For example, advancing some kind of government health care that works better than Obamacare, right? And certainly not advancing the traditional, tax cut agenda of the pro-business right. I think both those fights are going to happen, but I'm like the opposite of some of the realignment folks that we both know. I think those are going to take a back seat to the overarching glue that will be fighting the woke left. Like I actually think the cultural issues are going to take a front seat, and that's what's going to glue this new Republican coalition together. It's going to be pushing back against an increasingly radical woke party. But just to return to the Equality Act and the ERA, they know that in contrast to what's happening, I think, on the ground, the currently elected Republican Party is terrified of being called racist and sexist and bigoted, and transphobic and whatever, like all the phobias, right? They are terrified of that, and I think they know that. So, for example, on the ERA, Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski are both
exactly.
Yes, already on the record. So they actually have a chance to advance, I think, both the Equality Act and the ERA through a Republican Senate. So those are the things that I would worry the most about. That's really going to require a massive, mobilization on the part of the right and our new allies in the liberal left to stop some of this stuff from going through. Because I'm sort of despairing of all they'll need to do is pick off a couple, squishy Republicans on those issues, and they'll be able to advance those issues through the Senate. So to the extent that I'm scared of the legislative agenda, that's it. I don't think they're advancing healthcare. I don't think they're advancing packing the courts. I don't think they're getting rid of the filibuster. Any of those things. I mean, look, I could be wrong. We could lose, 2 races. The Republicans could lose 2 races in Georgia. They might be able to eke that out and sort of horsewhip their caucus into doing it. But I'm not. That is now a sort of secondary danger in my mind. But I absolutely think it's going to be a full court press on those 2 pieces of legislation and on critical race theory, on wokeness, on all of those cultural issues, which might be devastating in the short term and the results it might have on policy in this country, but is just going to energize the new woke, anti-woke coalition, I think, on the right, which is why I'm medium-term optimistic, short-term very pessimistic. I think it's almost the reverse as I was before the election. I was short-term optimistic because I thought Trump was going to win, but long-term pessimistic because of the direction and how far some of this woke Stalinism. I mean, with my background, I don't often sort of try to bring up comparisons to, totalitarian regimes. But I mean, these people are scary. They really want to control what you think. And they want to shut down any kind of substantive or serious discussion about any kind of controversial cultural issue in this country. It is terrifying. And I'm more optimistic after this election than before that there's a critical mass of Americans who see that. They see that danger from the left, and it concerns them. Now, they might not, some of them, on the margins, might have really disliked other things about Trump. Their political agendas in terms of economics might be totally different from yours or mine, but they see that danger. And that is enormously encouraging to me. That's why, in the medium term, I'm actually quite optimistic after this election.
Something to think about is I've always imagined the sort of cultural cost benefit analysis to Trump. It's a catch-22, right? In that on some of these issues, Trump is literally he's not a good messenger on some of the issues, but on those issues, nobody would be talking about it if not for Donald Trump. He's the only person that talks about the media in the way that it really, mostly deserves to be talked about. He's the only person that's willing to go to the mat and fight on some of these cultural issues. And yet, it's not necessarily in a way that's going to persuade a lot of suburban voters. But if it weren't for him talking about it, we wouldn't be able to have the conversation at all, period. And so he injects it into the conversation, and he's emboldened a lot of Republicans to, if you see someone who's largely an established Republican like Kelly Loeffler in Georgia fighting the Equality Act and fighting for girls' sports, that was inconceivable before Trump came into office and before Trump remade the Republican Party, because Republicans were utterly terrified of being called bigots by the media. Now they fundraise off of it. Now it's they relish the opportunity to be called bigoted and to sort of be into these culture war fights, because they know people have started to see through it, and they know it makes them look like warriors, and it makes them look, exactly what people want to see is that, they're out there fighting and not cowering, because people are so fed up with the ruling class in this country. But isn't that kind of, in a way, that's good? But the Republican Party moving forward has to learn to talk about these issues. They have to keep the Trumpian willingness to fight, and then combine it with some sort of messaging improvement. Is that one way to look at it, maybe?
So I'm of 2 minds about this because, first of all, I think I was for sure wrong. I think you were wrong on this too, because I think we had kind of similar views on it. But correct me if I'm wrong. I thought there was an exodus of the suburban woman, educated woman vote from the Republican Party. And we did see a shift, but nothing like what I thought was going to happen. My big question this election was, were we going to bring in enough working class voters of all ethnic backgrounds in order to sort of replace the suburban educated female exodus from the Republican Party. And I actually do think there's a way to hold those two. There's tension in those coalitions for sure.
Absolutely.
But if there's a way of seaming them together, it is exactly on women's sports. It is on these kinds of issues. It is on, Abigail Shrier's book, right? It's exactly things that Republicans have been afraid to talk about that those two coalitions have in common. In fact, that's the only way I see the GOP, cobbling together an actual working majority in this country is to center those issues. Because as soon as you move to economic issues, as soon as you move to other, other political issues, it's almost like I'm sure this comparison is going to get me into trouble and be misinterpreted. But prior to the Civil War, you saw the realignment, the political realignment of both parties around the only issue that mattered in politics, which was slavery. Right. Mm-hmm. You saw Northern and Southern Democrats who had previously had very different views on trade, on like all kinds of things than their Republican compatriots. All of those issues basically got jettisoned, and it became the Southern parties. The party, Southern Democrats became the party of slavery, and the Northern Republicans became the party of abolition. And it cut through every other political division. It cut through economic interest. In terms of, for example, tariffs, like there was an ongoing battle between the North and the South with regard to tariffs in this country because of economic interest. It cut through all of that stuff. There was a battle over whether, we should spend more on infrastructure or whether we should decentralize infrastructure. That was like a huge part of the 19th century politics. Didn't matter anymore. By the time you get to like 1850, the only thing that matters in politics is slavery. And your position on that issue determines where you're at. So I almost think that our politics is moving in that direction where the only issue that matters is are you woke or are you anti-woke, right? And it's going to cut through all of this other stuff, the different economic interests between the suburbs and new working class voters, as important as those issues are, as important as they were to getting Donald Trump elected in 2016. I think the awakening majority in America is going to be, if the GOP can seize it, is going to be, we see what's coming from the woke left and we're scared of it. We need to stop it.
Let's zoom in on your point right there. The question was, if the GOP can seize it, what would that look like in a potential Biden administration? And say, the 2 seats in Georgia are picked up. What do you think what does seizing it look like in a Biden administration?
I see this picking up seats in the Senate as much more of a like stopping bad stuff issue. We're not going to be able to advance much on the federal level, and we won't be able to stop these dear colleague letters. To me, the big question is, will the GOP in the states, which by the way, they held pretty much historic dominance, right? They have had historic dominance in the states. They lost a little bit in 2018. They picked up some of that lost back up. We still are, like, the Republican Party is in really good shape in the states. I think Ohio, for example, just went to its first Republican supermajority in a very long time. So the Republican Party in the states is actually really more where I would direct my seize the day sort of messaging. I think they need to so, for example, on the executive orders and the Dear Colleague letters we talked about with education, they need to answer every single one of these by, giving parents school choice, right? If Biden is going to make the public schools, bastions of critical race theory and going to allow boys into the girls' locker room and to run on the girls' teams, then Republicans should respond to that in the states by giving every single family control over the dollars that we all spend, the public all invests in their children's education, right? That is how the Republican Party should respond. They should say, oh, okay, well, you want to control the entire American public education system with Dear Colleague letters that don't have any public input, that don't go through Congress, don't do anything. You just want to advance this woke agenda, whether we like it or not, whether we want it in our schools or not. The response to that should be no. Like, you don't own that investment. Families own that investment. Students own that investment. It's for their future. It's not for your woke agenda. And if the Republican Party does that, and I think we have an enormous opportunity, the right has an enormous opportunity in education right now. I mean, I think the last few months have shown how self-interested the system is with regard to this debates over school closure. There's some really great work that my colleague and friend Corey DeAngelis has done on correlating where schools are more likely to be closed. And it is more correlated with teacher union power than it is with COVID infection rates, right? This is not about public health. It is about power. And you can tell that by the agenda. And I say that as somebody who takes COVID very seriously, actually. I think among Federalist writers, I might be the person who is most paranoid and thinks that we are in the middle of a serious pandemic and that there are health risks. But the demands of teachers' unions in these debates have been, one, they've shown that they don't care two figs about what the problems that families are facing with distance learning, with the need to have childcare for their kids. If you have a 2-parent working home or you have a single parent home, they have basically said that all families' concerns about their children's education are illegitimate and they just are, they don't believe in COVID and they don't believe that poll-wise, that's not true. Families are nervous about it, but they see the flip side of keeping the schools closed. So that's one. They've been completely they have not answered families at all on any of the concerns that families have had to a large degree. Obviously every school district is different, but then the demands moved from public health stuff to stuff that's nothing to do with it. There are teachers' unions demands in this country to shut down charter schools because the public schools aren't opening, right? There are demands to defund the police from teachers' unions. They won't open the schools until the police are defunded, right? They won't open the schools until private school choice programs are eliminated by the state legislature, right? They're using it as a club to get an entire political agenda that has absolutely nothing to do with a health crisis at all. And I think families have seen that. So when you combine that with the woke stuff that's about to get jammed through the system even more than it already is from the Biden administration, I see that as a huge opportunity for the right, honestly. And I think that would be the biggest, if we can get a substantial number of states to pass universal school choice, where families completely control the dollars that are assigned to their kids, and they no longer go automatically to district schools. That's the biggest, in my view, the biggest cultural win for the right in 70 years.
This is all contingent on something you said earlier, which is that there will have to be a new coalition of people on the left and the right. And that is emerging. A podcast Inez and I both really love is Red Scare, where you have these 2 leftist women who are just sort of culturally have such contempt for the neoliberal attitude that entirely consumes the Democratic Party and much of the left, and even people on the Bernie Sanders left. And so there are people out there that understand this. If you look at what Angela Nagel and Michael Tracy wrote when they, sort of did an autopsy of the Bernie Sanders campaign, it was that he was pulled down by some of the woke packaging. And so this does, your optimism and my optimism as well definitely is contingent on coming together as a coalition of people on the left and the right to push this stuff out of the mainstream in corporate America, out of the mainstream in newsrooms, and out of the mainstream in classrooms, if that's possible at all. But at least in corporations, boardrooms, and newsrooms, those are 2 important power centers to kind of purge this ideology from as best we can. What optimism do you have for continuing to grow that coalition? Is it possible when the ideology you're fighting essentially says you're either progressive or you're a bigot? And that really is the problem that this all boils down to, is that they're pushing the notion that if you're not progressive, you're a bigot. So people, the boomers who run boardrooms and newsrooms, they don't want to fight this because it's not worth it for them to be called a bigot. And so it's a massively, steeply uphill battle. And so I guess I'm just curious to see where you are in terms of thinking that's actually, possible.
So first of all, the way you framed it, I don't think it is possible. I don't think we're pushing wokeism out of the boardrooms. I think we're just diminishing the power of the boardroom. I think the job of this new coalition is going to be diminishing the power of American institutions as we currently see them, right? And that makes it a fundamentally, in some way, unconservative project, right? Or anti-conservative project, small c, right? I've actually never liked this definition of conservatism. I like my conservatism with actual content. I think in America, what it has to mean is preserving the content, the ideas of the founding. I don't want to be tied to like preserving any tradition anywhere. Like not all traditions are good. And by the way, you need a standard by which to judge whether or not civilizational traditions are good or bad. And that has to come from outside. So you have to have some kind of normative or ideological commitment, right? And this frustrated me about this is a long-term frustration of mine with the sort of Kirkian right. But yeah, I see our project as a sort of guerrilla warfare against the institutions and against the power of corporate America, the power of most particularly the academy and the universities. So in terms of how we're going to win that battle, I don't think we win in the corporate boardroom. I think we cut off the flow of the cultural Maoists from below, right? As in, the entire university system in this country is utterly dependent on the lifeblood that it gets from free federal loans, right? So 92% of the student loans in this country are originated and held by the Department of Education. There is virtually no private loan market, student loan market in this country. And so to me, like any serious Republican Party before passing tax cuts would have cut off the money to essentially, the training camps for the ideological opponent. But we all know that the Republican Party is useless. And in any case,
it's less useless on these issues now, though.
Yeah, well, I hope they start to become less useless. Like, I hope that they seriously think about how do we tackle these institutional assets of the woke left, and how do we either, take them over for ourselves, or at least restore them to some kind of neutrality, although I think that's probably a fanciful notion, or how do we diminish their power? And in that regard, again, I'm optimistic because every survey shows that in some ways this is very bad. Don't get me wrong. In some ways this is terrible. Right, but we can't rebuild proper institutions. There's a reason that trust and faith in virtually every institution in American life, from universities to corporations to all branches of government, right? The only institution in long-term surveys done by Pew and Gallup that has above 50% approval rating is the U.S. military, right? That's it. We don't trust anything else. We certainly don't trust the media anymore, right? But each one of these institutions has had not just a hand, but the primary hand in the demise of its own respect and trust from the American people. And I mean, the lack of self-awareness after 2016 of these institutions, you had like this brief shining, 2-week moment where they actually thought like, maybe we were really missing something here. Maybe there were structural problems, both cultural and economic, in America prior to the 2015 when Donald Trump started running for office. Maybe we should start to investigate some of those problems and actually take seriously the opinions of our fellow Americans. That died in like 2 weeks, right? And then it was straight on the train of we have, now 71 million bigots in America, and or Russia elected Donald Trump. Right.
I was going to say it was Russiagate. As soon as they figured out how to latch onto Russiagate, they went full steam ahead and never looked back. And as soon as they lost that, they went full steam ahead on impeachment. I actually wrote a story that's up on Federalist today about this, that they spent 4 years doing everything but what they should have been doing, which is reevaluating and like actually being seriously introspective about all of these things that were wrong in the party. And they flirted with it over the years a couple of times. Like they got really excited about Randy Bryce in Wisconsin.
With it, by the way, have you seen, like, I don't know, I didn't read your piece. I will go back and read it. But they're not even flirting with it, by the way, now.
No, not now. Well, now they've, over the course of the Trump administration, they developed this developed this notion that neutrality is actually bad, and that making overtures to the white working class, for instance, necessarily involves bigotry and necessarily involves coddling and being complicit with bigotry. So of course, now they can't even flirt with the notion of reconsidering or reconfiguring their appeal with the white working class, because they believe, and everyone tells them, pressures them out of it, because it's necessarily a bigoted project.
And not just with the white working class, right? With Hispanic working class, and to some extent even with the African American working class, right? They have no, if this BLM meeting, right, was actually serious, because frankly, African American Democratic voters should demand something from their party, because they get courted every 4 years. They get expected to turn out in huge numbers, and that's basically the difference between winning Democratic ticket and a failure. And they don't get much in between, right? Like Democratic politicians are not going to court the constituencies they already feel are in the bag. But if instead of meeting with BLM, right, the Democratic Party actually had some kind of self-awareness, and a lot of these institutions had some kind of interest in actually understanding what's going on in the country, they would meet with some of the Hispanic and Black voters who voted for Donald Trump after voting against him in 2016, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they can't afford. There's still totally time for the Republican Party to screw this up. Don't get me wrong. But I see this as the beginning of a realignment in the same way that you always hear about the Southern strategy, which, there's some kernels of truth there, but they're only very small in comparison to a much longer term trend with the African American vote moving from the Republican Party, where they primarily were in the 19th and early 20th century, to the Democratic Party. It started with the New Deal. It started with FDR. And there's a long-term economic issue trend. And this is when the Democratic Party was overtly bigoted. Like, to some extent, the Republican Party was as well, but the Democratic Party was overtly bigoted. Wilson resegregated the civil service after it had been integrated after the Civil War, right? You had, FDR was overtly discriminatory towards African Americans. But nevertheless, you started this slow trend away based on economic interest towards the Democratic Party. And by the time you get to, Goldwater in 1964, by the time you get to the 60s, it's almost more of a coincidence than anything else. It's in some ways, it's the same mistake that I think a lot of people make today, which is that, for example, they assume that like Hispanic voters vote on immigration as the top issue. Like you realize there are other issues that affect Hispanic families in this country that aren't immigration, right? Like, but in the same way, I think people assume because the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, like that must be the defining moment in some way for the African American vote trends in this country. And in many ways, it was not, right? Despite being incredibly important and positive, like people were looking at a whole list of issues when they decided which party they were going to support. And their solidification of the African American vote in this country for the Democratic Party was decades in the making by the time you get to the Civil Rights Bill of 1964, which, by the way, the previous Civil Rights Act had all been voted for by Republicans and killed by Democrats. So I think there's something similar going on now, potentially. I do think that there is a longer term, perhaps a slow burn of realignment where you see especially Hispanic families in rural parts of the country seeing their interests as much more aligned as rural Americans, rather than seeing first and primarily their interests as Hispanic Americans being about immigration, which is just very condescending also to assume that like every immigrant family in this country primarily votes on immigration, particularly when people put a lot of effort into coming to this country legally. It's not an easy process. But that's even beside the point. My point is that like this issue does not define the votes of millions of Americans in this country who happen to be of Hispanic descent. But in any case, the GOP can definitely still screw this up, this realignment. But I do think like there's the possibility for that kind of realignment where the country becomes less racially polarized politically.
Yeah, I have. So based on, I want to branch off into the two sort of two directions to wrap things up off of this, which is the first one being, you mentioned Barry Goldwater and the realignment conversation that happens right now. A lot of it is in the context of big tech. There's conversation about an industrial policy from Tea Party senators like Marco Rubio. This is what really sparked the conversation about the realignment, in addition to some of the identity politics issues. I wonder, one thing that I really loved about Inez is you have identified as a Tea Party conservative, like long after the Tea Party, and I think, you know, I'm a believer in limited government. And
flag over here, like,
yeah, no, exactly. It's like it's always 2009 for Inez. Oh, that actually makes sense with your Lana Del Rey fixation. But anyway, the so the Tea Party was, some people say the Tea Party was never really about policy. It was never really about the deficit, and Trump proved that. And I think to an extent that's right. I'm personally, as a proponent of limited government and as Reaganism and of Reaganism, which is, you know, kind of referred to pejoratively as zombie Reaganism now, alarmed by some of what I've seen. But without getting into the virtues of an industrial policy or Section 230 reform, what do you think? How do you think it plays in terms of the realignment? How do you think it plays with voters? How do you think the Republican Party actually post-Trump has durable gains and inroads in the African-American community, into Hispanic communities? How important do you think the economic realignment is to that?
I think the economic realignment is extremely important. I think the big tech issue is going to be critical. I mean, I think it's sort of an extinction level issue for us, right? And I say that again with skepticism towards some of the solutions, not only because I have, you know, my Reagan impulses, but I'm trying to check those and just look at the issue. I'm not convinced that the solutions are really going to solve the problem. And I think sometimes people, so I'm from Silicon Valley, grew up in Silicon Valley. So, like, you know, the people that I went to high school with are running the world now. And that terrifies me, by the way, completely, utterly terrifies me. I don't want them to run the world. I don't think they're good world domineers, whatever.
They're bad oligarchs.
Good. I don't think they'll make good oligarchs. They don't even have good taste, right? Like, at least you want your oligarchs to have good taste, so like the plebes can kind of scrap up. This is the Catholic concept, right, of why you need all the gold and the beautiful cathedrals, because like the poor need to see some beauty and imagine that a world, a life could be better or whatever.
I was gonna say, you're sounding very Eastern European right now.
No, but like I do think that it's sort of an extinction level event, and I think we need to do something about it. But the solutions that have been presented to me rely on the idea, two things. One, paradoxically, for people who say they totally reject libertarianism, they rely on the competitive impulse to check the leftward direction of these companies in order so that they will retain or be competing for right-leaning customers, right? And that's the idea behind breaking up some of these companies, right? But it's not at all clear to me that 3 Twitters are any less left than 1 Twitter. Because the problem is a monoculture within the class of people who goes to college, gets a degree in computer engineering, gets a degree in the kind of things that you need to work for some of these companies, including communications and all that. The problem is there's a monoculture within that ruling class. And unless you address that issue, you're not going to solve a tech issue by breaking up Twitter into 3. You're just going to have 3 companies that censor conservatives. Mm-hmm. And it's not clear to me that editing 230. I mean, yeah, it's like satisfying in the sense that they'll get sued more, but they won't be sued because they deleted your Twitter account. They'll be sued because they left something up, right? And that they're liable for it. So if anything, it's going to make them more censor happy. So like, this is an issue that genuinely I don't have an answer for. I would love for somebody smarter to come up with something, because I do see it as, like I said, an extinction level event. I think we have to be able to communicate in this way and to advance our ideas in this way, or we are screwed, right? But the solutions that have been advanced so far don't seem to me to get to the heart of it. the only solution that I have that is too long term of a solution, but we have to gut the academy, right? Like the root of all of this is the universities and the academy and education. And long term, we got to address that. Like that should be first rule in a hole, you stop digging. What we do after that, now that these companies are taken over by the left, at least we can stop the next generation from advancing into those companies in some way. But if we found our balls somewhere, which is the Republican Party. But yeah, I mean, I don't know what you think about some of the solutions that have been advanced. I'm not convinced they're going to work, right? So even if I'm willing to, like, okay, let the government do it, screw Reaganism, screw my libertarian, sort of Tea Party impulses. I'm just not convinced they're going to work. And but before we talked about that important thing, I just do want to say something about the Tea Party because I do think it's relevant to this conversation. And I think it's really commonly misunderstood about the Tea Party. So obviously there were 10,000 Tea Parties, and there really was no centralized message. But I never saw it as it's only about the debt and economics. That is not. It's the Ron Paul movement started in 2007. That was about the Fed and like the Tea Party that I participated in was the gentleman's revolt against all the things that Trump was the ungentlemanly revolt against, right? It wasn't just about the debt. Yes, the debt is important. It remains important. But it's a long-term threat now comparatively to the other threats that we're facing. The Tea Party was also a cultural impulse that we are losing something essential about our identity as Americans. That we are losing some of our heritage, our connection to a way of life in this country. And that was absolutely at the center of the Tea Party. Every Tea Party event I ever attended, it was not just about dollars and cents. It was not just about the Paul Ryan agenda, right? It was, if we keep going in this direction, we are going to lose something essential about ourselves as Americans.
I love that. I think that's such an important reflection because it shows that there's a populist strain of patriotism, and that mingles with a populist strain against political correctness that is so important. And your quandary is actually kind of a perfect segue into the last thing that I wanted to ask you about. And it's something that we could do another entire podcast on, and hopefully will at some point, which is that wondering if even if these sort of proposed government solutions would do the job is a fair question, because to your point and to your dilemma is that a lot of this is rooted so deeply into our culture now that there isn't a government solution, sort of like outright fascism that it's not like within the bounds of plausibility or something that anybody should want, that would actually root it out of the kind of the places that it's so deeply rooted into, be they academia. Pop culture is a huge one. Corporate culture is a huge one. So to your question to me, how do I think? I mean, I would say exactly to your point, gut the academy. You reform the pipeline and then you clean up the mess that it made in the so-called real world and make it so that those boomer executives and their Xer, people that'll come after them are empowered to say, you don't get to tweet in unison that running an op-ed by Tom Cotton put Black NYT staffers in danger. It's about empowering the people in leadership to, make sure that that's clearly unacceptable to imply that words are violence. And I'm all for free speech and the marketplace of ideas, but they have a monopoly right now. And so it's kind of breaking the ideological monopoly that's so important. And private companies should feel comfortable, doing that. That's my long-winded way of getting to my last thing that I want to ask you, which is something happened to our popular culture under Donald Trump. And I'm curious to see how you think that will continue to evolve under Joe Biden. We've had, you and I have had conversations plainly just about fashion on this podcast before, and I think those are some of the most interesting podcasts that we do. What happened under Trump was the youth culture got even grungier, and there's an interesting connection to, Abigail Schreier's book, which you mentioned earlier, about gender dysphoria. And, maybe kids dress like Billie Eilish because they want to cover their bodies. They're the most physically scrutinized generation. They have to put everything of themselves on Instagram for their entire classmates to see and comment on and compare with one another. Where do you see popular culture going in the next 4 years under a potential Biden presidency?
I don't want to pretend to usurp your position as queen of pop culture on the right. I'm like the opposite. I think it's really important. I have this dilemma. I think it's really important for the right to engage in popular culture. And I love your work for that reason and all this stuff. But like, I am so hopeless on these issues. I mean, I might as well be like denim skirt wearing a homeschool stereotype on that front. And I wasn't homeschooled. I went to public school. All right. But my parents did have a TV. We had like a TV with the rabbit ears and it only had ABC. Like that's like literally the only channel that I was ever able to watch at my
torture.
And I grew up watching Westerns because my parents are they immigrated. Sorry, my dog is barking.
That's okay. Is that Thor?
Yes, my dog Thor. No, but like literally my parents raised me on Westerns. So I'm like so hopeless on this question. I cannot give you a good answer. Other than to say there are some glimmers of hope, I think, with Gen Z, as much as I hate their fashion sense. In the sense that there does seem to be some amount of rebellion against this like stifling. I think honestly, our generation, the millennials, is probably the worst on this stuff, right? Like we are the super, 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 super woke, offended, perpetually. Like I think there is a bit of a rebellion going on in Gen Z, and I'm not going so far as to say they're all going to turn out conservative and they're whatever. But I do think that the fact that they've been force-fed an anti-American ideology from kindergarten all the way up and through high school actually, is going to shape their views in a very negative way for the country. But I do sense that glimmer of like, my dad would tell me in high school, like, what is wrong with your generation? We rebelled against our parents, and here, all these ex-hippies in Palo Alto, smoke weed with their kids, like they're rolling their kids' joints, and the kids are like duplicating their parents exactly, right? They have no rebellious instinct whatsoever. What's wrong with you guys? Because when I was your age, we were actually rebelling against our parents, rebelling against you guys are just meek little sheep that are just sucking up every bad idea from the baby boomers, like straight out of the bottle, man. And I think that's kind of true. And I think for Gen Z, it might not be, right? Like maybe because their parents are Gen X and not baby boomers, right? Maybe because just, 2 decades of oversensitive, therapeutic, self-care girl boss culture is just freaking enough. It's enough. It's not cool anymore. It's boring. It's dull as heck. It's anyway, maybe it's enough. Maybe I do feel like there is something rebellious again about Gen Z that is not in millennial culture. And that is, again, this is the most optimistic podcast I've ever done.
Yeah, wow. And as you're so like sunny and happy.
It's like a ray of sunshine over there.
Yeah, really. It's so no, I mean, what I think happened is that as the ideological monopoly over pop culture got firmer, our pop culture also sort of started splintering. And that's really for business reasons and technological reasons. Now there used to be a couple hundred shows every year. Now we're up to, I mean, that's like 10 years ago, but now we're up to, like 1,000 shows every year, 700 shows every year. So everybody's sort of hanging out in their different niches. And that means, as Gen Z is seeing this like ideological monopoly being enforced by the arbiters of pop culture, the people who are still in power at the glossy mags that are dying and at the cable news networks, all down the line, as they're seeing the ideological monopoly grow stronger, what they are also seeing is all of these new options and all of these people telling them that that's wrong. They can see Joe Rogan have a real conversation as opposed to whatever the heck happens, over at the New York Times. They can see what happens when you let different ideas in, and that gives them a curiosity, I think, whereas our generation, we were caught in between. Like that splintering didn't happen when we were really young. Like we didn't have like 50 different Snapchat stories, and Ben Shapiro on Snapchat. You wouldn't have known to read Ben Shapiro unless you were like a little Ben Shapiro yourself. You were watching, cable news and reading all of these books and subscribing to National Review or whatever it is.
I was a politically incorrect baby. Okay, my bedtime was after Bill Maher's. Correct. I would watch Bill Maher every time, and that's when I had to go. This is before he got kicked off of like network TV, right, for saying that the 9/11 hijackers weren't cowards because they flew themselves into buildings. Which I think is a very relevant point, but he made it like 2 days after 9/11, and Bill Maher. But anyway,
a great reminder of how old you are, Inez.
Yeah, exactly. I will close on this. I think I'm, again, enormously optimistic. There are different levels of optimism for different institutions. I'm somewhat pessimistic about our fight against the universities only because I'm so pessimistic about the Republican Party finding any sense of spine. And I think that's one of the most important battles. So like that is a problem. Like we need to fix that. I am very optimistic about media. I think the article that you and Ben Domenech wrote together was fantastic and is very true, right? I do think what you just said about there is a thirst for real, substantive, civil, but like heated. It's not like civil, like civility, sort of Ben Sass civility where we're nice to each other because we're Nebraskans. It's civil in the sense that we're going to resolve our differences within a conversation and not by excluding half of our neighbors from our lives, half of our family from our lives, our friends from our lives, right? And I do think there's a real thirst for that. And there's been a new media rising to meet it that is way more substantive than cable, right? It's way more substantive. It's not 30 seconds, talking points debate. It's real conversations about things that matter, about, human happiness, about relationships, about not politics in the like day-to-day sense, but what does it mean, almost in a classical sense, right? What does it mean to have a good life? Like these questions have been important and fascinated us for 4,000 years for a reason, and they've been, any kind of serious discussion of them has been crowded out of the conversation by, on the one hand, sort of baby boomer media that just doesn't have room for it. And on the other hand, those sort of woke impulses of our generation, it's like, oh no, as soon as you have a heretical thought, we have to excise you from the conversation. And the new media is very much in the space in between those things, where it's accepting of, transformation, it's accepting of change, of realization. It's not looking to cancel people. It's looking to have a real conversation. And then on the flip side, it's not sort of just yelling at each other, but actually engaging on some of the most important issues that aren't just, sort of politics, but are about life. And so that is very, I do think that's very encouraging. I think your article and Ben's article on it was fantastic. And I think that is the future. And that's good news. Like whether you're a conservative or you're a heterodox thinker of the left, it's good news that we are actually going to be able to have these conversations, and it's great news that people want to hear them. Right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's a lot of reason to be optimistic about the new contras, as Ben coined the term to refer to some of these new media figures, heterodox new media figures, who are figuring out ways to monetize heterodox thought. I think the trick is going to be to get to insulate Patreon and Substack and all of these places that are helping them before
these places, because the tech thing is spreading, and that is my worry with tech. By the way, it's not just the new public square of being able to advance your views on like Twitter, Facebook, whatever. Because it's kind of, I kind of have sympathized a little bit with the sort of libertarian argument that you're not owed a Twitter account, right? But it could develop very quickly into a social credit system, completely privately managed, right? You have a wrong think, tweet. Not only are you banned from Twitter, right? But perhaps Uber and Lyft don't want to contract with you to take you anywhere, and perhaps your bank then drops your ability. Like you can snowball this very easily, and perhaps like the servers themselves then, start to pull them, which we've already seen with sort of neo-Nazi websites and websites that nobody really wants to defend because they're heinous, but like the trend is worrying, right? The trend is not just that you won't be able to be on Twitter, it's that you won't be able to be on the internet. And then the likewise, you won't be able to have a real life. Like all the private institutions on which you rely to have a modern life will cut you out. I mean, that is as coercive in many ways a system as a totalitarian regime. Like, yes, it's much more comfortable than the Gulag. I don't want to go to Siberia. Please, like, let's not, I'm a Californian. I like the warm. I don't, I admit that this is better than the Gulag. Okay. So don't, misunderstand me, but it is incredibly chilling. And it's making people cultivate two selves, one internal self where you think about things, and come to conclusions, and a different external self. Like that is what happens in totalitarian regimes. That is like very, very worrying to me. And I mean, that's why I'd say this is an existential problem with tech. It's absolutely an existential problem. I don't know that like amending 230 is going to fix that.
Yeah. What I love about this is it has tried to end the podcast on an optimistic note, and then I coerced her. Right, then we went straight to the Gulag in terms of the conversation, not physically, because as Inez mentioned, she's a California.
I hope we're Gulag bunkmates, and we can like slip notes and like start radio free bunker, whatever.
I look forward to that. No, I don't. Don't put us in we will not last long. All right. Inez Stepman of the Independent Women's Forum. You should absolutely follow her work, particularly when we spoke earlier in this conversation about the Equality Act, the Equal Rights Amendment, and those potential dear colleague letters that we saw in the Obama administration that you may see again in Biden administration, potential Biden administration, that you likely would see again. So make sure to follow Inez's work. You can find it on IWF.org. That's correct, right?
Yeah, that's right. IWF.org.
Perfect. Make sure to check it out. You can follow Inez on social media. Thank you so much for your time, Inez.
Thank you for having me. It's always a good time.
Cool. Well, we will be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.